Imagine waking up in a small, windowless room. You're chained to a cold metal frame, your head heavy, your body weak, and then a tape recorder clicks on. A man's calm, methodical voice begins to tell you exactly what's about to happen. How you will be restrained, how you'll be tortured, and how you'll never escape alive. This isn't the script of a horror movie. This was real, and it belonged to David Parker Ray, a quiet mechanic, a neighbor, and a father who lived a double life as one of the most sadistic predators America has ever known. They would later call him the Toy Box Killer. Before we open that door together, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this isn't just another crime story. This is the kind of dark truth you won't want to miss, and we have much more ahead. But to understand Ray, we can't just look at the nightmare he built. We need to step back. To truly grasp how an ordinary man could hide the darkest of urges, we have to rewind time. Who was David Parker Ray before the toy box? How did a boy born in a small New Mexico town grow into a man obsessed with power, control, and suffering? And why did his victims, often vulnerable women already on society's edge, never return to tell the world what he had done? This story isn't just about a killer. It's about the silence of fear, the psychology of sadism, and the thin mask of normalcy that monsters wear. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just another crime story. It's a descent into the hidden world of a man who turned his fantasies into reality and built a torture chamber that still haunts investigators to this day. David Parker Ray lived for decades in a place called Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. A town with a strange name, and one that would later carry an even stranger horror. To most, he was just a quiet guy down the street. A mechanic. A neighbor. A man who fixed engines and minded his business. But behind closed doors, he was sketching blueprints, collecting tools, building what would later be known as the Toy Box. A place so carefully designed, so deliberately engineered, that it could only be the work of someone who had been planning it for years, maybe even decades. When investigators finally broke into that trailer in 1999, hardened officers admitted they had never seen anything so terrifying. The walls, lined with instruments of pain, the gynecological chair bolted to the floor, and the tapes, the most chilling piece of all. One of those tapes was his introduction for new victims. It began with a calm, almost professional voice explaining to the bound and blindfolded woman what she could expect. He stripped away all illusions of hope. He told them exactly how powerless they were. That voice wasn't he just giving instructions. It was breaking the human spirit before the torture even began. This was David Parker, Ray's theater of cruelty. And his victims weren't just women. They were audiences trapped in his nightmare performance. But here's the question that lingers like an echo. How does a man like this come to be? Where does the darkness start? To unswear. That. We have to go back. Long before the toy box. Back to his childhood. Back to a boy named David who grew up in shadows, learning lessons no child should ever learn. Because what you're about to see is that monsters are not born in cages. They are shaped in the silence of broken homes. And so, before we open the toy box, we open the past. To understand the monster David Parker Ray would become, we need to begin with the boy he once was. Because before there was the man with the toy box, there was a child born into neglect, loneliness, and cruelty. David was born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico, a dusty, quiet town that gave no warning it would raise one of America's darkest predators. His father, a violent alcoholic, drifted in and out of his life, leaving behind scars more than memories. His mother, overwhelmed and distant, abandoned her children to be raised by their strict and often abusive grandparents. This is where David's earliest lessons came from. Not of love, not of nurture, but of control, punishment, and shame. His grandfather was a harsh disciplinarian, the kind of man who believed that fear was the only way to shape a child. There were no gentle words, no warm embraces. Instead, there were rules, endless rules, and consequences for even the smallest mistakes. The young David grew up in an atmosphere where emotions were suppressed, where crying was weakness, and where silence was safer than speaking. Imagine being a child in such a place, learning quickly that the world was not safe, that people could not be trusted, and that affection was a currency you would never earn. And yet, it wasn't just the discipline that marked him. It was what his absent father left behind. Though his father was rarely around, when he did appear, he brought with him a collection of disturbing adult magazines. These were not simply images of nudity. They were violent, sadistic portrayals of women in bondage, tied, gagged, beaten. For most children, a father might bring toys or baseball gloves. For David, it was violent pornography. These images, planted in the mind of a lonely, impressionable boy, became more than just pictures. They were seeds. They grew into fantasies. Fantasies about power, about control, about domination. Fantasies that would eventually consume him. Teachers later recalled David as shy, withdrawn, and awkward. He didn't fit in with the other boys. He was bullied for being different, for being quiet, for never really belonging. That loneliness only drove him deeper into his private world of imagination. And in that world, control and pain were central themes. Psychologists often talk about a cycle, how abuse and neglect can distort a child's sense of right and wrong, how shame can turn into rage, and how unmet needs can twist into dark desires. David was a textbook example. By his teenage years, those violent fantasies weren't just passing thoughts. They were becoming blueprints. He began experimenting with small acts of cruelty, hurting animals, creating drawings of bondage and torture, building makeshift devices in secret. This wasn't just curiosity, it was rehearsal. And yet, to the outside world, David was still just another boy from a small New Mexico town. He blended in. He didn't stand out. Nobody knew what was brewing inside. Nobody saw the volcano slowly forming beneath the surface. But David knew, and in the silence of his room, a nurtured Italiano, every insult from a bully, every blow from his grandfather, every absence of love from his parents, all of it hardened him. Anasagrea. So did the darkness. This is the part of the story where you realize that monsters rarely appear overnight. They're shaped over years, shaped by abuse, shaped by loneliness, shaped by silence. David Parker Ray's childhood was the perfect storm for a predator to emerge. And soon, the quiet boy would become a man who wore a mask of normalcy, while secretly preparing to live out the fantasies that had consumed him since childhood. Because what started as shadows in his imagination were about to become reality, and the world would never forget what came next. On the surface, David Parker Ray was unremarkable. A mechanic, a neighbor, a man who blended into the background of a small desert town. He lived in truth or consequences. New Mexico, yes, that's the real name of the town. A quiet, sun-baked place, where everyone seemed to know everyone. It was the kind of community where people waved at you in the street, where secrets rarely stayed hidden. And yet, David managed to hide the darkest secret of all. By all accounts, he looked like just another working man. He was skilled with his hands, particularly with machinery. Friends and co-workers saw him as dependable, a bit quiet, maybe even awkward. He wasn't the life of the party, but he wasn't someone who drew suspicion either. That's the thing about predators. They don't always stand out. Sometimes, they survive by being invisible. But behind the scenes, David was building a private world fueled by his obsessions. His fascination with bondage and torture seated in his childhood didn't fade with age. It grew stronger. He began collecting magazines, photographs, and equipment related to sadomasochism. What others would dismiss as disturbing or fringe, David treated as his education. And then there were the relationships. On paper, David seemed capable of love. He married not once, but 4 times. Each marriage ended in failure. His partners described him as controlling, manipulative, and at times frightening. Yet somehow, he always managed to appear just functional enough to avoid raising alarm. In private, he tested boundaries. He experimented with ropes, restraints, and psychological manipulation on his partners. What for them may have started as consent bled quickly into coercion. David wasn't interested in intimacy. He was interested in control. Every relationship became another rehearsal for the future he was carefully constructing. Neighbors later recalled him as someone you might wave to across the street. The guy who fixed cars, rode motorcycles, and kept mostly to himself. He wasn't a social butterfly, but he didn't seem dangerous either. That was his camouflage, a quiet demeanor, a small-town job, a man who seemed normal enough, but normal was the mask. Behind closed doors, the mask slipped. His collection of bondage equipment grew. His fantasies became journals of drawings, notes, and plans. What fascinated him wasn't just pain. It was domination, the complete breaking of another human being's will. He studied psychology, learning how fear could control a mind even more effectively than chains. By his 40s, David had perfected the art of appearing ordinary. He was polite in public, hard-working at his job, and invisible in the ways that mattered most. But in the shadows, he was preparing for something bigger. His private obsessions had outgrown bedrooms and notebooks. He needed space. He needed a place where his fantasies could breathe. And so, the idea began to form. An idea for a place where no one could hear screams. A place where his fantasies would no longer be confined to imagination. The world saw a mechanic, but what they didn't see was a predator rehearsing for his life's darkest performance. Because David Parker Ray wasn't just collecting tools, he was building something. And soon, the mask would come off, revealing the nightmare he had spent decades preparing. The nightmare called the toy box. Every obsession needs a stage. For David Parker Ray, that stage would become one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. It began as an idea, a place where no one could escape. No one could scream loud enough to be heard. No one could resist his control. He needed more than ropes, more than threats. He needed a fortress, and so he built one. From the outside, it looked like just another trailer, an old, weather-beaten mobile home parked on a dusty lot near Elephant Butte Lake. To a passerby, it was nothing unusual, just another piece of desert junk blending into the New Mexico landscape. But inside, Ray had engineered his masterpiece. The trailer was soundproof. Every inch of it was designed with one purpose: to strip human beings of hope. Against the walls, shackles and chains hung like tools in a workshop. A large gynecological chair sat at the center, not for healing, but for torture. Medical instruments were arranged with precision: scalpels, clamps, syringes, and speculums. There were whips, belts, and paddles. There were electrified devices and saws. It was less a room and more a laboratory of suffering. And then there was the tape. Before every torture session, Ray would play an audio tape. He had recorded a cold, monotone voice welcoming his new prisoner. The words were clinical, almost businesslike. He told his victims exactly what would happen to them. He explained in detail how they would be bound, violated, and broken. It wasn't just cruelty, it was psychological warfare. By stripping away hope from the very first moment, he made them as long before he ever touched them. On the shelves were videotapes. Ray documented some of what he did, not for evidence, not for memory, but for replaying his fantasies. He was building not just a prison, but an archive of pain. Ray called it his toy box. To him, it wasn't horror, it was art. A stage where he could direct his twisted performances again and again. But this wasn't built overnight. It took years of planning, collecting, building. He modified the trailer piece by piece, spending thousands of dollars, carefully crafting a place where no one could escape him. Every lock, every chain, every tool had a purpose. What made it worse was the meticulousness. He wasn't sloppy. He thought of everything. How to transport victims without being noticed. How to keep them drugged. How to erase their memories so they could be released without exposing him. His crimes weren't random. They were calculated. Imagine standing in that room. The smell of rusted metal and oil. The silence, broken only by the hum of desert wind outside. Every object in the toy box had a history, a story written in screams that would never be heard. This was no longer about fantasy. This was no longer about imagination. The toy box was real, and soon, David Parker Ray would begin filling it with the living, breathing victims who would suffer inside. But a prison without prisoners is just a cage, and Ray was ready to put his toy box to work. David Parker Ray's toy box was no longer an idea, no longer a construction project in the desert. It was ready, and once it was ready, there was only one thing missing as victims. Ray knew exactly where to look. He targeted women who lived on the margins of society. Sex workers, runaways, women struggling with addiction, women whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms. Women who, in his words, the world would not miss. At first, the approach seemed almost casual. He'd offer a ride. He'd buy someone a drink. He'd pretend to be a customer. His charm wasn't overwhelming, but it didn't need to be. His uniform as a state park ranger, or his reputation as a mechanic, gave him credibility. He looked like someone safe enough to trust, at least for a short while. Then came the drugs. Sometimes he slipped sedatives into drinks. Sometimes he used brute force, overpowering women with a calculated coldness. The moment they blacked out, the ride ended, and the nightmare began. When victims woke, they weren't in their homes, or in their cars, or on a dusty roadside. They were chained inside the toy box. The first sound they heard wasn't their own voice, or Ray's voice, but a tape. The recording. It always began the same way. Calm, clinical, and chillingly methodical. Ray explained, in detail, what would happen. There was no guesswork, no false hope. He told them they would be bound, tortured, violated. He told them escape was impossible. And then he told them to accept it. Imagine the psychological impact of waking up in chains and hearing a stranger's voice mapping out your suffering like an instruction manual. It wasn't just physical violence, it was mental destruction. The women who survived often described the same sensation. Time dissolved. Hours felt like days. Days felt like years. Bound, gagged, blindfolded. They were trapped in a cycle of pain and fear. Ray didn't simply torture. He broke down identity, hope, and humanity itself. But here is the detail that makes his crimes even harder to trace. Not all his victims were killed. Many were released. After days, sometimes weeks, he would drug them again, wipe their memories with heavy sedatives, and dump them back on the streets. Broken, confused, unsure of whether what they had experienced was a nightmare, a hallucination, or reality. And so, most never went to the police. Who would believe them? A story about a desert trailer, torture chambers, and audio tapes sounded like madness. The shame, the fear, the drugs coursing through their systems. All of it kept them silent. This silence was Ray's greatest weapon, because silence meant safety, not for the women, but for him. But silence doesn't last forever. In hushed whispers, in fragments of memory, some survivors began to talk. Stories began to surface, in bars, in shelters, in police stations. Something dark was happening near Elephant Butte Lake, something no one could quite put into words. And for David Parker Ray, this was only the beginning, because once he had tested his methods, once he had perfected his tools, once he had confirmed that silence would shield him, he no longer had to hold back. The toy box would become more than just a room of nightmares. It would become his theater, and the world would remain blind to the horrors inside. David Parker Ray might have been meticulous, cunning, and cruel, but for years he operated largely on his own. His toy box was a one-man theater of terror that changed when he found someone willing not just to stand beside him, but to participate. Her name was Cindy Hendy. Cindy wasn't a stranger to hardship. She had a history of trouble, drug use, and abusive relationships. By the time she met Ray in the late 1990s, she was adrift, vulnerable, reckless, and looking for direction. To most people, she was just another woman lost in a cycle of bad choices. But to Ray, she was something else. A potential accomplice. Their relationship began like many others in his life. Control, dominance, manipulation. But Cindy was different. Instead of recoiling at the darkness Ray revealed, she leaned into it. He told her about his fantasies, about the toy box, about what he had done to women before her. Instead of running, Cindy stayed. Soon, she wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his partner in crime. Together, they became a chilling team. Cindy lured women in promising rides. offering a friendly face, sometimes even befriending potential victims before handing them over to Ray. Once inside the toy box, she didn't just watch. She helped, holding victims down, assisting in restraints, even taking part in the torture herself. It's a disturbing truth about human psychology. Some people, when exposed to horror, reject it. Others, like Cindy, are drawn to it. In Ray, she found power. In Cindy, Ray found validation. Their sadism fed off each other, creating something even more dangerous than either of them alone. Neighbors and acquaintances began to notice strange things. Cindy moved into Ray's property near Elephant Butte Lake, and the two kept to themselves. They were reclusive but not suspicious enough to raise alarms. No one could have imagined that just beyond the walls of that dusty property, women were chained, tortured, and silenced. Ray was already methodical, but with Cindy, he became bolder. She encouraged his darkest impulses, and he rewarded her with a sense of belonging. To Cindy, this wasn't just about sadism. It was about loyalty, love, and the twisted feeling of being needed by a man who demanded absolute control. One survivor would later testify that Cindy's presence made the nightmare even worse. Victims expected a woman to show compassion, to be a potential savior. But Cindy betrayed that expectation. She wasn't there to help them escape. She was there to make sure they never did. This was the ultimate betrayal of humanity. Two people, united by cruelty, turning suffering into a shared intimacy. And together, they escalated. More victims, longer torture sessions, more elaborate methods of restraint and psychological control. With Cindy in his corner, Ray had someone to guard the toy box, someone to silence screams, someone to erase doubts. But no matter how perfect a predator thinks they are, there's always a mistake waiting to happen. Cindy, with her reckless streak and dependency on alcohol and drugs, would eventually prove to be the weak link in Ray's carefully constructed nightmare. Because when one victim finally found the courage to fight back, it wasn't just Ray's control that was tested. It was Cindy's loyalty. And what happened next would tear open the toy box, spilling its horrors into the world for the first time. By 1999, David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy had perfected their routine. Victims came and went, some released, some never seen again. The toy box was operating like a machine of terror, hidden in plain sight in the quiet town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. But even the most carefully engineered nightmares eventually crack. That crack appeared in the form of Cynthia Vigil, a 22-year-old woman whose strength and determination would expose Ray's world of horror. On March 19, 1999, Cynthia was lured by a friend of Reyes, under the pretense of drugs and a ride. Instead, she was delivered straight into his hands. The trap was efficient. The door slammed, the chains tightened, and the tape recorder clicked on. Once again, Ray's cold, monotone voice filled the trailer. Instructions for her captivity, a preview of the torment she would endure. For 3 days, Cynthia was tortured, chained to the gynecological chair, whipped, shocked, assaulted, all under the supervision of Ray and Cindy. But unlike many of his previous victims, Cynthia never surrendered her will to survive. Every second, every act of cruelty, she was studying, waiting, looking for a weakness. That weakness came from Cindy Hendy herself. On the 3rd day, Cindy made a mistake. While preparing to clean up the victim, she left the keys within reach. Cynthia, battered but unbroken, lunged for them. A struggle erupted. In the chaos, Cindy was injured, and Cynthia managed to slip free of her restraints. What happened next was nothing short of cinematic. Cynthia, naked, except for a metal collar and a chain still hanging from her neck, bolted from the trailer. She ran across the dusty roads of Elephant Butte, desperate, bleeding, screaming for help. A passing motorist spotted her and rushed to call the police. For the first time, the toy box's walls could not contain its secret. When law enforcement arrived, they were stunned. Cynthia's injuries and the collar around her neck were undeniable proof of captivity. Her testimony painted a picture so horrific, many officers initially struggled to believe it, but she wasn't exaggerating. When investigators followed Cynthia back to Ray's property, they opened the door to something out of a nightmare. Inside the trailer, they discovered the truth. They found chains bolted to the ceiling, medical instruments stained with old residue, restraints of every kind, and then the audio tapes. Ray's chilling voice, methodically explaining to victims what he planned to do to them. Cynthia Vigil had not just saved herself, she had ripped the mask off one of the most sadistic predators in American history. For David Parker Ray, the illusion of control was shattered. For Cindy Hendy, loyalty would soon dissolve under the weight of police interrogation. And for the world, the toy box was no longer a rumor, no longer a hidden chamber. It was evidence, undeniable, sickening evidence of systematic torture. But the discovery of the trailer was only the beginning. What lay inside the toy box would send shivers down the spine of even the most hardened investigators. When investigators stepped into the trailer for the first time, the air itself felt heavy. What lay before them was not just a crime scene. It was a chamber designed for suffering, crafted with meticulous care by a man who had spent decades feeding his darkest fantasies. The toy box was more than a nickname. It was a fully equipped torture chamber, hidden inside a soundproofed cargo trailer parked near David Parker Ray's home in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. Every square inch was calculated for control and cruelty. Against one wall stood a gynecological chair, bolted firmly to the floor, with leather straps designed to pin down every limb. From the ceiling hung chains, pulleys, and hooks, ready to suspend victims in positions of helplessness. Nearby, investigators found whips, clamps, surgical scissors, and saws, some rusted, some carefully cleaned, all tools of torment. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't just the hardware, it was the audio tapes. When officers pressed play, they heard Ray's cold, deliberate voice. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't excited. He was calm, methodical, like a teacher delivering a lecture. On one tape, he greeted a new victim with chilling detachment. "Hello there, bitch. You're here against your will. Soon you'll learn what's going to happen to you." The tape would play for every woman he brought into the toy box, serving as both an introduction and a psychological weapon. Victims weren't just restrained, they were conditioned, broken down by the realization that everything was planned in advance. In drawers and cabinets, police found detailed medical equipment, syringes, speculums, scalpels. Many were adapted for sadistic purposes. There were electric shock devices wired for precision, even a motorized contraption designed for prolonged torture. It was as if Ray had built a laboratory where human suffering was his experiment. The inventory list grew longer and darker. Collars and chains of every size. Blindfolds and gags. Photos and videotapes of victims, some faces identifiable, others forever anonymous. Personal belongings of missing women. Jewelry, clothing, scraps of identification. But perhaps the most chilling evidence were the handwritten journals. In them, Ray documented his crimes with unsettling detail, dating back decades. Some entries described kidnappings, others recorded sessions with victims. Though he rarely mentioned names, the sheer volume suggested dozens of women, maybe more. Investigators faced an unbearable question. How many victims were there really? The FBI later estimated between 30 and 60, though some feared the number was closer to 100. The trailer itself seemed to confirm it. It wasn't a place for a handful of experiments. It was a factory of pain, used repeatedly, refined over years. As police combed through the toy box, many hardened officers struggled to keep their composure. Some described it as the most disturbing crime scene they had ever encountered. The combination of surgical precision and sadistic creativity revealed not just a killer, but a man who had dedicated his life to engineering suffering. The toy box was no longer a hidden nightmare. It was evidence, undeniable proof that David Parker Ray had built his life around cruelty. But while the tools and tapes painted a horrifying picture, they didn't answer the biggest question. Where were the bodies? That mystery, along with the true number of his victims, would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and the public for years to come. When Cynthia Vigil escaped that night in 1999, she not only saved her own life, she ripped open the door to David Parker Ray's hidden world. Her testimony gave police the key they needed to finally move in. But as the case went to court, a chilling reality set in. Exposing the horrors of the toy box was one thing. Proving them in a courtroom was something else entirely. Ray was arrested, along with his accomplice Cindy Hendy. Investigators believe they had stumbled upon one of the most prolific serial predators in American history. They had the trailer, the tools, the tapes, and the journals. They had Cynthia Vigil's first-hand account of torture and escape, but what they didn't have were bodies. And in a justice system that runs on evidence, the absence of bodies was a devastating obstacle. Prosecutors brought charges of kidnapping, torture, and sexual assault. They believed Ray had murdered dozens of women, but without remains, murder charges were nearly impossible to sustain. The FBI estimated as many as 60 victims. Some investigators whispered the number could be higher, perhaps even close to 100. But Ray never confessed, and no graves were ever found. The trial itself was a spectacle. Survivors who dared to testify described the unimaginable: being drugged, strapped down, and subjected to pain for hours, sometimes days. Cynthia Vigil's testimony was especially powerful. She recounted how Ray played his recorded message, how he and Cindy worked together to break her down, and how she managed to escape by sheer willpower. In court, Ray sat stone-faced, almost emotionless, too many watching. His demeanor was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. He didn't rage. He didn't break down. He denied. His attorneys painted him as a man with strange fetishes, perhaps guilty of rough sex, but not a murderer. They argued that without physical proof of deaths, the prosecution was building a monster out of shadows. But the evidence from the toy box spoke volumes. The tape recordings, the tools, the journals. These weren't the habits of a man experimenting with consensual kink. They were the fingerprints of a predator who had dedicated his life to suffering. After months of hearings, negotiations, and testimony, David Parker Ray accepted a plea deal. He was convicted of kidnapping and torture and sentenced to 224 years in prison. Cindy Hendy, his accomplice, received 36 years after testifying against him. Still, justice felt incomplete. Families of missing women in New Mexico and beyond begged investigators to connect their loved ones' disappearances to Ray. But with no remains and no direct proof, most of those cases were left open, lingering in uncertainty. The FBI continued to search for bodies. Cadaver dogs were brought to Elephant Butte Lake, where Ray was rumored to have dumped victims. Dives and excavations were conducted. Nothing conclusive was ever found. In the end, Ray went to prison not as a convicted killer, but as a convicted kidnapper. Yet, to those who studied his crimes, there was little doubt. The toy box wasn't built for games. It was built for death. But there was one question that haunted everyone: investigators, survivors, even the public. Why? What drove David Parker Ray to dedicate his entire life to inflicting pain? The answer lay not in the courtroom, but deep in his psychology. A mind twisted by trauma, fueled by sadism, and addicted to the one thing he could never get enough of: control. By the time David Parker Ray was sentenced, the world had already given him a name: the Toy Box Killer. But what he left behind was more than a nickname. It was a question that has haunted psychologists, investigators, and anyone who's heard his story. Why? Why would a man spend decades designing a chamber of torture? Why record a cold, mechanical message to play for his victims, detailing their fate like some nightmarish instruction manual? Why dedicate his life not to love, creation, or purpose, but to pain? To understand David Parker Ray, you have to strip away the courtroom and the sensational headlines. You have to go back to the broken boy he once was. He grew up under the shadow of abuse, abandoned by parents, raised in a household where love was scarce but cruelty was abundant. Children in environments like his often grow into one of two things: victims or perpetrators. Ray chose the latter. But childhood trauma doesn't excuse what came next. Instead, it shaped his obsession with domination. As he grew older, his fascination with bondage and sadism escalated. What started with dark fantasies in magazines evolved into an all-consuming addiction. For Ray, control was everything. The more he inflicted pain, the more powerful he felt. And over time, that craven became his identity. Psychologists believe Ray suffered from sexual sadism disorder, a condition where arousal is directly linked to causing suffering. But with Ray, it It wasn't just sexual, it was spiritual. He believed that causing pain gave him meaning. Survivors described him as methodical, almost ritualistic. He didn't act in chaos. He planned, he prepared, and he executed with the precision of a man following a script. This is what made him so terrifying. He wasn't fueled by rage or impulse. He was fueled by joy, a dark, twisted joy that came from watching others break. Ray. Women weren't human. They were objects, test subjects, for his fantasies. And in that dehumanization, he found freedom. But like all who hide behind masks, the truth eventually caught up with him. In 2002, just 3 years after his arrest, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in prison. He never confessed to a single murder. He never revealed where bodies might be buried. He took his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only questions. Did he kill 30 women? 60? More? We may never know. What we do know is this. The toy box wasn't just a trailer. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of human depravity. And perhaps the most chilling lesson of all is that evil docentee always come with wild eyes and blood-stained hands. Sometimes, it looks like a quiet man in your neighborhood, a mechanic, a friend, a father, a man you'd never suspect until it's too late. David Parker Ray may be gone, but the shadows of his toy box remain. Shadows that remind us that monsters are real, and they don't always hide under the bed. Sometimes, they build one for you. So the next time you lock your doors, remember this story. Because trust can be the most dangerous thing of all. If you want to hear more true crime documentaries like this, stories that peel back the mask of humanity and expose what lies beneath, make sure you subscribe, because next time, we'll unlock another chapter of darkness, and you won't want to miss it.